It's connecting. We are live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Legal Geeks discussion of episode 6 of the Star Wars series Andor, entitled The Eye. I will go around and introduce everyone in a moment. With us previously was one of the founding members of the Legal Geeks, attorney Joshua Gilliland. Josh is having a little issue with his voice and is feeling a little under the weather, so I am going to try to do my best to moderate this discussion with our remaining panel of attorneys and military folk. So going around, in addition to Josh, we have Bethany Blanton of the Space Force. Welcome, Bethany. We have attorney Thomas Harper. Welcome, Thomas.
Hello.
And we have attorney Jordan Hoopert. Before we move on to first impressions of the episode, which I'm eager to hear, I will give the usual disclaimers. No one on the pod is speaking on behalf of their employer. Our discussion and lively debate about the law, as it may or may not apply to fictional and fantastical facts, is not legal advice, and this podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. With that being said, let's move on to first impressions. Just going around clockwise from my view of the Zoom. Jordan, what were your first impressions of this episode?
I really liked this one. I'm glad they got back to a little more of the action. We finally got to see the kind of, well, literal and figurative payoff for the heist that they were planning the last couple of episodes. The kind of intrigue and everything that that flowed through it. I thought this was a really well done episode. I really enjoyed it, and I'm interested to see where the kind of ending goes with Luthien, I think, and the guy from Ferrex, whose name I've forgotten. So I'm kind of interested to see where that goes and to see where Cassian surfaces next. But it's got me really excited to see what the next little arc is going to be.
Yes, absolutely. Thomas, what are your thoughts?
It was really, really good. It was a nice payoff episode for the arc. It was one of those where I'm like, you just have to wait for the 99% of any military operation, then you get the pew pew and bang bang. But I saw a sort of an article headline that I thought put it nicely, that the eye moment was on par, if not exceeding, that sort of wow factor that you got from the Holdo maneuver. And it was just like one of those amazing Star Wars moments that only Star Wars can create.
Yeah, a lot of fireworks in this episode for sure. A lot of things happening at that very that last 15 minutes or so of this episode. Bethany, what was your reaction?
I really enjoyed this episode. There was a lot of range of emotions and events. So it was very action centric, but there was also a lot of planning, a lot of tension, and a lot on the line for all of our characters that are shown. So, but I absolutely loved it.
Awesome. And Josh, you joined us. Your thoughts?
For just the brief communique, love this episode. It reminded me of a World War II spy movie, and that's in part because of the location and the sets. It did have that vibe. Excellent cinematography, excellent direction, beautiful storytelling, and the fact that they kept it small and realistic. There's a lot to be said. This wasn't, we're going to blow up the base. There wasn't anything that outlandish. It was steal as much money as they could and then escape. And that was excellent. So I really loved this episode. Exceptionally well done.
Yeah, I enjoyed the episode as well. Like the others, I was really looking forward to seeing what the payoff for this heist that's been 2 episodes in the works was going to be. But I also really enjoyed the deeper understanding of the Empire and the Donnie people that develops during this episode and the importance of their cultural and spiritual event, and the fact that to the extent they can do so without getting themselves killed, they do express their resentment and resistance and disapproval of the Imperials, with telling, Lieutenant Gorn, for example, may the eye stay open long enough to find the good in you. I thought that was a really chilling and well-placed line for him that he kind of follows up on later in the episode. Okay, well, let's get this underway as far as the topics for discussion. Our first topic is entitled Espionage on a Military Base. In episode 6, we see Cassian and his compatriots actually execute the heist with help from Lieutenant Gorn. And in earlier episodes, we saw that they actually have some pretty specific information about the physical layout of the garrison and how long it takes, for example, for support to arrive from this nearby Al-Kenzi Air Base. Thomas and or Jordan, are there any comparisons to make here between the activities of Cassian, Gorn, and company and conduct covered by U.S. statutes that talk about espionage?
Yeah, so espionage is interesting because the scope of it, I think, is broader than what anyone might think if you haven't dealt with the crime. And it's intentionally done that way as a crime because you can spy in all sorts of ways, both very low tech and high tech. So we're just for reference in the U.S. code, we're looking at Section 903 of the U.S. Criminal Code, Article 103 Alpha for just general espionage, like a real lightweight criminal article, I'd say. But just a great example. Transmitting maps or sketches, right? Like your mind doesn't immediately go to artistry when you think of espionage, but that's just it, right? And think about the application in the arc of this story. They have a sand table of the base, and by that I mean a mock-up of the base that's been built that they're using as sort of a critical element of all of their planning. Well, that got transmitted. That either got they spied on the base from afar and got the schematics, or they perhaps from Gorn or elsewhere got that information transmitted to them. And that's what this article, this code section is trying to get at, the vast array of ways that you can steal secrets or steal sort of sensitive information. And you can actually get, so the code section is interesting in that it discusses a court martial. So it does envision application of this code section used against military members. And one of the unique features, not just with espionage, but with any sort of crime that's found in the US code, if there is not a comparable code section or article, I should say, within the UCMJ, the UCMJ has this neat little feature. It's almost like it functions like a criminal code vacuum, where you can vacuum up a statute from the U.S. criminal code and charge somebody at a court martial with that sort of identical charge from the U.S. criminal code, without it being anywhere in print in the UCMJ. And that has an obvious function, because we don't want military members to get away with something just because it doesn't appear in that document. Espionage is not one of those, but certainly it's a major offense there. It actually happens more often than you'd think, not very commonly, right? It's not like a larceny or failure to report, like a very a little more common crime, but it does happen. I just, as a short story, I had a client that was incarcerated at a naval station at Chesapeake, so they have a small prison there. And at the time, there was a high-ranking Navy officer who was awaiting court-martial there for allegations that he had tried to steal secrets pertaining to some of our spy aircraft and sell them to the Chinese. So it does happen. It's certainly probably more active of a charge than say misbehavior before the enemy, which we talked about last week, and we'll talk about a little bit more today.
All right. Thanks, Thomas. Any other angles on espionage that anyone else wanted to offer?
I think it also depends on what they would like, how risky of a location they would consider this planet to be, because your command has different levels of authority, also dependent upon what kind of environment you're in. So if you're in a deployed hostile location and you're putting the mission or national security or your team at risk or your base at risk, there are different levels of consequences, and there's more power that a base commander has over you in a deployed location. So like I would definitely not want to get caught if I was LT Gorn. So
You saw the reaction when the commander realized that Gorn was somehow in on this. It was just total
yeah.
bafflement, and you could feel that bafflement transition to anger really fast.
Yeah.
Apparently it's a testament to Lieutenant Gorn's skills in deception that he didn't trigger any alarms until that very point when they're in the midst of the heist.
Very dutiful officer is what I would call him as a defense counsel.
Okay, well, unfortunately, espionage is the beginning, not the end of potential criminal liability indicated in this episode, in which the group forcibly invades the garrison at a minimum with intent to steal money that the Empire owes to its employees. So we've also got some hostage taking. We have the murder of a colonel. We have some hijacking of a aircraft. A possible jurisdictional question about when you've got crimes being committed on a military garrison, who can prosecute that and under what law. Thomas has gotten into that a little bit already, but what else should our rebel infiltrators potentially be lawyering up for here?
I guess the start of the question, and I'll follow up on what Thomas was saying, is under what jurisdiction can these guys be prosecuted? And the answer, I think, unfortunately for them, is a lot of them. Taking comparisons to our laws, if there were federal laws or military laws that are broken in the country, in the state, that are also state laws like theft, then both the state and the federal government can prosecute the same crime simultaneously. I deal with that from time to time, not necessarily military things, but drug laws are often prosecuted by both the federal government and the state government. And there's something called the separate sovereigns doctrine, which says jeopardy doesn't apply to one prosecution by one sovereign against another sovereign. So even if you're convicted at the state level, you can also be convicted at the federal level, which can cause real problems for folks. So these guys, depending on what the laws on Aldhani are, they could be prosecuted under the local laws as well as the laws of the Empire, which would be interesting. Now, they can also be prosecuted for a ton of stuff. And really, I think the least of which is the theft and hijacking, the theft of the ship at the end. They also, I guess, burglary comes to mind whenever you're trespassing or breaking in somewhere that you're not allowed to be with the intention to commit a crime, not just theft, but any crime. While you're wherever you're not supposed to be, that's an additional crime called burglary. Taking hostages, kidnapping people, or false imprisonment. And then you lead up to murder. And I don't know if anybody else wants to cover all the intricacies of the felony murder rule, but the idea behind it is that if you are committing a felony and there is a risk that someone is going to die and someone does die, then you are responsible for that death. So, you know, the classic example of two people robbing a bank and one of them shoots a guard. If you go in to commit an armed bank robbery and one of you shoots a guard, the other one is just as liable for that murder. So, whether or not the whole crew participates in killing the folks, the Imperial officers, the whole crew is just as liable for that.
Application of that is really interesting with regard to Colonel Pettigar, because he's sort of the classic case of the unintended victim. Nobody pulls a trigger and puts a blaster bolt in his chest. Looks like he just dies of a heart attack because of all the stress from this crazy event, and just sort of keels over and everything goes to hell after that point. And
sorry to interrupt you. Are you thinking of the
Oh,
colonel
sure.
or the commandant?
No, the commandant, I'm sorry. Yeah, Colonel Pettigar took a blaster bolt to the chest. But the commandant keels over, and that's sort of the classic. That's why the felony murder rule can be a little bit controversial at times, because the idea in criminal law is we want to fix appropriate responsibility for crime and intent. Well, this guy, they had the intent to rob him and his garrison and to make him work and assist in the loading of the gold. Nobody intended to kill him, and in fact, that was a specific condition of the whole operation. You give us what we want, we let you go, and we let your family go. And unfortunately, he doesn't hold up. And this would be a classic case where they would be on the hook, and it would be a tough legal argument to get out of liability for that murder, because but for their actions in this heist, the commandant lives probably. I don't know what his like his latest health checkup is. Seems to be expanding according to his wife.
You might end up on the hook for like a criminally negligent homicide or something like
Sure.
that, but it'd be tough to prosecute them for murdering him, because you'd have to prove some kind of intent. I don't think they intended to cause a heart attack or whatever he died of.
True.
I did wonder if they could also actually be charged with Nemec's death, because even though he's their teammate and they are trying to take care of him, and in their shoes, I don't know that I would have done differently. In a court, it could be argued that they didn't take Nemec to an official doctor or the nearest emergency room, essentially. Like they took him somewhere further to get care from a rather sketchy, if well-meaning individual. So I was actually wondering about that, is if their choice of care was not the best quality or not official care, if they could be liable for Nemec dying as well.
That made me sad. I really wanted him to make it.
You're calling
too.
Dr. Quadpaws questionable? This like fine purveyor of galactic medicine?
I question the creativity of naming the four-armed doctor Dr. Quadpaws, but yes. I think they could be liable for Nemec's death, whether or not they take him to the nearest hospital. He also dies because they are recklessly escaping a major theft, and they don't secure their cargo.
Yeah.
And he gets crushed. So again, I don't know, you probably wouldn't get murder convictions, but some kind of reckless disregard for human life or something like that is a manslaughter, or a basis for manslaughter or something like that. They'd probably be concerned about liability for that.
One backdrop in all of this that ties back to the espionage piece is that were this a traditional armed conflict, so state versus state, this type of operation would probably fall within the bounds of what's lawful under armed conflict. Now, espionage itself, there's a carve out there, and you take some unique risks if you're spying on the battlefield. But a straight operation, even one involving deception operations and theft of enemy equipment and enemy materiel, squarely within the bounds of what's lawful, if not risky. Now, under a normal set of circumstances, we've talked about combatant immunity before. the fact that they broke laws, that they killed people, that they spied and broke into this facility and stole a freighter and all these things, that immunity, that combatant immunity would shield them from all of this, from those charges, domestically speaking. They don't have that as just regular old insurgents. And I talked about that risk. That's a huge risk. And there's a great note in the outline about espionage and sort of proving that up as it relates to Nemec's manifesto. And I think absolutely the Empire would be looking to maximum criminal exposure for this group and to avoid any kind of legal shield. And so they would absolutely want to connect the dots and say, not only are you not entitled to that legal protection and combatant immunity, but even if you were, the espionage, we're able to try you as spies who were caught if that had happened. And therefore you have lesser protections than the average fighter on the battlefield anyhow. So they've really created a stinky onion of problems for themselves.
Yeah, definitely. Bethany's observation goes to not just Nemec, but there's quite a few co-conspirators who don't make it back. So Terriman being one of them, Terriman, the former stormtrooper, and then it appears that Lieutenant Gorn has also perished as well. And so any further thoughts on how the felony murder rule or rules applicable to wartime conflicts may apply to those deaths?
No, one thing that I'll say is ordinarily, if you were operating, we talk about Aldani laws. I don't know how complex their legal code would be. Their civilization seems to be, I would kind of liken it to what I saw in Afghanistan a little bit. You probably have areas, it sounds like the enterprise zone is more built up. That might be like a Kabul, maybe a Kandahar type location. And then you have these sort of further flung areas, a little more tribalistic, a little further away from the flag in the capital. And when the U.S. goes out and operates in locations like that, or really any country in the world where we have troops, whether it's Germany, Poland, et cetera, we have what's called a status of forces agreement. So an agreement with the host country, what is and isn't lawful, how the two nations' laws will apply. You saw at the very end of the Iraq War, there was a real stalemate and sticking point between SOFA as it related to criminal liability for U.S. soldiers under Iraqi law. The Iraqi parliament, as it changed hands and became a little less amenable to U.S. troops based on their opinion of some things that had happened, they wanted U.S. troops to be able to be prosecuted under Iraqi law, and just outright the U.S. government didn't want to entertain that. That ultimately led in part to the drawdown and the withdrawal in 2011. And so inevitably, if the Rebel Alliance were like a state, you would have a SOFA. The Empire seems to have something like that. We'll get into like property law on Aldani and that base exchange in the lease in a little bit, but you don't have that defined here. And so the Aldanis, to some extent, probably more so with the Empire, would want some of their laws enforced.
Yes, no doubt they would. Let's see. Well, speaking of those that were left behind, some of the rebels don't make it out. And so could we talk a little bit about the risks that poses for the ones that did make it out going forward in terms of their visibility to the Empire? And are there any other loose ends from this mission that could come back to bite Cassian or Vel or any of the rest of them that did make it out?
Well, it's not the season finale yet, so I'm going to assume that some of this comes back to bite them later. We see at the end of the episode the big ISB mobilization. Everybody's got to stay. Nobody's going home. We're rolling out all of our contingency plans, whatever that means, or planetary emergency retaliation plans, I think is what they call them.
Mhm.
I assume we'll see what that means. But Yeah, we're safe to say there's going to be an investigation in this one. Not the least of which they're going to find Gorn and Terramon's bodies, presumably, although this is Star Wars, and so never assume anyone is dead just because you see them shot. But assuming they're dead, they're going to find their bodies. They're going to be able to run their records. They're going to be able to check, who they were, and they're going to start trying to track down who they were with and who their associates were. They've got plenty of people who can provide descriptions of what these people looked like, although for a lot of reasons, that's not necessarily as good evidence in the real world as it often is on TV. As it turns out, people are exceptionally poor eyewitnesses in stressful situations, especially, and your ability to identify someone is not great. Funny personal anecdote on the subject: when I was over at the county jail where I work, I don't work at the jail, but where I go to see clients, there's a lobby waiting area, and I was sitting out there waiting to get in to see somebody, and all of a sudden this person literally drops down out of the ceiling tiles and just takes off out the front door. And the other attorney who I was with and I are just like, did that just happen? And so at the time, the jail had pictures on their website that you could go in and look up and see a picture of who was incarcerated. So when I got back to the office an hour later, the receptionist and I were going through the roster of people in the jail trying to figure out who it was. I missed it. I did not get it. But yeah, people are especially poor at identifying other people. So the description of the rebels by the kidnap victims and the Imperials who were taken hostage are probably not going to be as good as they might be, among other factors. We look at things like whether or not the identifier is the same race as the identifiee. Our ability to identify people goes way down as we cross races. Things like weapon focus, where if you're in a stressful situation and someone is pointing a weapon at you, your focus is going to be on that weapon, not necessarily on the person who's doing it. We could go on, but if you're really interested, Oregon has a pretty fascinating case called State versus Lawson James that covers a lot of issues with eyewitness identifications. If you're really interested, you should look it up and take a read. It's actually kind of fascinating. But so we have the corpses, we have the witness identifications. The other things I thought of that the ISB is probably going to look for is any kind of DNA, fingerprinting, anything like that they can match up to people's files. I don't remember if everybody on the heist team was wearing gloves. I think they were. But if they weren't, fingerprinting is going to be a big problem for them. DNA for anybody who, was cut, dropped hair follicles or something like that. If the ISB can find them, they're going to be scouring for all of that.
Holocam footage is possible. I don't know what kind of surveillance the base was rigged up with, but that's a definite possibility. And Deputy Inspector Karn, although I guess he's been stripped of that title now, he's got to come back at some point. And you saw him in the last episode. He still has that sort of hologram mugshot of Cassian, and he knows what he looks like. And so he's going to come back in at some point. And I have to think that there's going to be some identification, at least of Cassian by looks, and they're going to thread it back to the corpos and see if they can connect the dots. And that links you
Wait.
into Luthen as well.
Okay, I'm not wrong. That was Karn who was in Luthen's shop at the end, right?
I don't think it was, but then again, I didn't pause and get a good look at Karn. It could have been.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure, but if he gets some sort of inkling of the ISB's investigation, then he might surrender the like image he has of Cassian. Additionally, I don't know if they left things behind in the camp that could be
Yeah.
identifiers of some kind. And I think Cassian and Vel are actually a little bit of a threat to each other if either of them get caught. Like they parted ways with Cassian pointing a weapon at her. And that's not exactly a lot of incentive for either of them to keep their mouths shut if they get caught and interrogated by the Empire. So there might not be that many people left alive who know specifically who did it, but there's a whole trail of evidence. And Vel seems pretty broken up as well. I have a hard time believing she's just going to disappear into nowhere and not keep fighting.
Yeah, it's a really excellent point that we hadn't touched on yet, the lack of cohesiveness among the group members and the fact that their relationships were tenuous to begin with and starting to fall apart at various times over this episode and episode 5. So another potential risk to all of them, which kind of segues nicely into our next topic, which is the murder of Skeen. We have another murder after we get out of the literal line of fire, and while Nemik is being unsuccessfully treated by Dr. Quadpaw, Skeen proposes this plan to Cassian that they just take the money from the other co-conspirators and split it and run. And Cassian's response is to shoot him. In fairness, many people had a bad feeling about Skeen to begin with, but setting aside any legal defenses, which may be dubious, could this be defended from a tactical standpoint, or is this a bad tactical decision as well?
I mean,
It was very
if you
Han
want to keep
Solo-esque.
something a secret, it was very Han Solo-esque.
Yeah. Cassian shot first, always.
If you want to keep something a secret, the best way to do it is not tell anybody. And so, if Cassian wants to keep his involvement a secret, he better make sure that nobody else is around to tell people he was there.
Criminally speaking,
I was just gonna say it's the same thought I had with when you were talking about Vel and Cassian. I mean, they are now two of the only people who can really point the finger at the other. And if Vel is captured and they say, we'll offer you a deal if you testify against, to put this in more real world terms, if you testify against your co-conspirators, that's a time honored used police tactic.
Yeah. And she clearly knows Luthen. She's a thread that connects them, even if she doesn't know Cassian's real name. For Skeen, I don't know that even if he found his body and realized, hey, this is a former prisoner of whatever facility he was incarcerated at as a kid, I don't know that the trail runs much deeper than that. But from a criminal standpoint, there's not much justification for Cassian to kill him, at least not at that point in the conversation. For a traditional self-defense argument, for you to use deadly force, you got to be in fear of death or serious bodily injury yourself.
Imminent death or serious bodily
injury. It's a stretch. Yeah, it's a stretch there, right? Skeen, no doubt, would probably pull the blaster on you, but you're a little bit early in the conversation before that. He's still hatching a plan. Cassian just shoots him because he's an a-hole and he doesn't like him and he doesn't like the way that this is turned. And as an audience member that was like jarred by this whole pivot, I was fully on board with that. It was like watching Han blast Greedo. I was like, okay, well, on we go. But yeah, Vel remains a big threat. Josh also brought up Cinta. You know, she walks off the base in Imperial garb, and her sort of escape and pathway forward.
Yeah. I think that while you can definitely say that Cassian shooting Skeen it's cold-blooded, it's jarring. He's definitely resorting to just shooting people when he hits dead ends or risky choices. At the same time, he is exceptionally desperate at this point, because you have to think, if Skeen is willing to turn on Vel, he's absolutely willing to turn on Cassian. And that makes him an extreme liability, not just from a financial perspective, but from a like risk to your life and safety and freedom in the future. Because you know that if Skeen doesn't get his way, he's definitely not, like, he is demonstrating that he's not going to help out his co-conspirators at all.
No.
Like, he's not a part of the team. Cassian now fully knows that one way or another he's a risk to the team. So he does kind of what we see him do in Rogue One. Is it defensible? You could make some defenses from it, but morally he did shoot someone in cold blood that didn't have a weapon drawn on him, wasn't threatening his life at the moment, wasn't even threatening to betray him to the Empire at that moment. But it's a Cassian is clearly desperate, and we've seen situations like that on the battlefield before with military units, where if you have a commander who's ordering you into situations that are going to get you killed, that aren't going to achieve an objective, there have been stories of people who get shot by their own soldiers because they are leading so terribly and so riskily that those soldiers wind up feeling like they don't have any choice. It's not common, but there have definitely been stories of it over the past 2 decades, and a number of stories in Vietnam of the like. So it's I think it's difficult to understand like that mentality where you believe that someone's a risk to your life or your future, in that moment when it's like you against the Empire.
That's a great
You
point.
can-
Bethany, you'd be a great defense counsel for Cassian. I also think it's a great point, because what does it say about Cassian's view of the rebellion at this point? This is less a legal point, more a story point, but this is his first peek into the rebellion, and he's seen nothing but dysfunction and backstabbing. I mean, it's no real surprise that he decides to bail out of desperation at this moment and make a withdrawal from their take. Because it's the rebellion, not just Skeen, it's like the rebellion as a whole is a liability to him. And this is the crew that Luthen vouched for, that he brought him in on, and this was the opportunity that Luthen promised him as an entryway to start getting back meaningfully at the Empire. And this is where it's gotten, or this is where it unravels to. So no surprise at all that Cassian wants to take his money and run.
You can also drop back to the other last episode where Skeen is holding a knife, I think it was, to Cassian's throat and threatening him. And that might be helpful if you're looking for legal defenses.
Yeah.
For Cassian is that they've got this history where this guy has threatened to kill Cassian a couple of times. The other interesting point I took away from the conversation, which again, like Thomas, is a little more story and a little less legal, is that, as it turns out, Skeen has lied to get on board with this heist. And there is no brother, there is no sunken farm, and he's just there for, I don't even remember if he said why he was there. But it's interesting to me to think of this from Cassian's perspective of, Well, Luthien lied through his teeth to these guys about why I'm here. This guy has lied about why he's here. There is zero chance that there's any cohesion left in this group after this, and I'm out of here. I do think it speaks highly to Cassian's character, though, that he only takes the portion of the payout that he was promised, because he's got them kind of over a barrel at this point. He's literally got Vel at gunpoint, and she's kind of the last one left. He could have taken the whole thing.
Yeah,
might have been-
he does seem to have a moral code between that and the fact that he did actually leave Vel alive. If you carried his logic about Skeen completely to the end, then he would have shot Vel as well, and probably the doctor. If he truly wanted to leave like no one left who knew him, and he thought that everyone else died in the mission, Cinta included, because he doesn't know that she's still alive, then he could have just shot everyone. And I think that you're completely right about Skeen as well. His like, oh, we need to take care of Nemec. We need to take care of him. I think that was literally just so that he could get Vel distracted and try and take the money. Yeah. And if Cassian had been in the tent as well, Skeen would have just taken off with all the money.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have offered to pay. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, this is what we call mitigation workup for after Cassian's convicted. But he's a really good guy at heart.
He offered to pay for Quadpaw's ship. He didn't just steal it out of the
and
shed.
Presumably he did pay for it.
Yeah, with the stolen money.
Little things.
Those are details. Don't worry about that.
All right. Any further thoughts before we pivot to back to the Donnie people and the matter of this exchange of goat hides?
I have so many thoughts about this one.
Yes. So earlier in episode 3, we learned that the Empire has driven the Donnie people south out of the Highlands and towards this newly created enterprise zone with imperial housing and factories, which sounds kind of like another company town. And then in episode 6, we witnessed the Donnie exchange these hides with the Empire for a 3-year lease, which struck me as a little bit ambiguous, but it appears that it's the Donnie who are leasing what used to be their sacred lands back from the Empire. Any issues with this arrangement?
Many?
Who would like to start?
Yeah.
Bethany, why don't you go ahead?
So it clearly seems that there's a lot of pressuring, to put it mildly, going on. Like they clearly do not have a choice in this arrangement. It's farcical on the Empire's side and forced on the Aldani side. And it does remind me as well why it's so important to have State Department and cultural experts and diplomats involved in these types of situations, or it turns into something like this. And we've seen examples of reparations and agreements between military bases and local Afghans in Afghanistan, for example. One that comes to mind is after essentially during a mission where an Afghan miner was killed accidentally, reparations were given in the form of a bunch of sheep pushed out of a C-130 to the village with no discussion, no apology, and that was thought to be appropriate. And the State Department person had to come back in and say, hey, we actually have to have this conversation and see what's culturally appropriate to this specific village, these specific elders, this specific family. It matters culturally whether this person was the oldest child or the youngest child. It matters culturally what that family status is in the village. You can't just hear what other bases have done and try to, in a ham-fisted way, copy that without following the protocol. and this strikes me as being very ham-fisted. Like the Empire is doing pretty much everything it can to just force the Aldani people out of this area. And they plan for this to be the last ceremonial watching of the eye from this location. And that's just chilling. Like the Empire is, it's not willing to fully engage in some type of genocidal action at this time on this particular planet, but you can see that they're not going to let this happen again, regardless of what the locals want or believe, which is, yeah, it's really upsetting when you think of it in that way.
Right, the Empire is entering into this lease even though they know that they have no intention of allowing the Donnie to return to the site the next time the eye occurs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
It's
that seems to be a condition, like a central condition that the Donnie people understand as part of the deal, that access piece, and would materially influence negotiations if it were to be taken away. What were you going to say, Jordan?
I just say it's a good reminder of the idea of power in contracting, and that if you're contracting with someone who has just orders of magnitude greater power than you do, are you really willfully entering into a deal? Is there an actual meeting of minds? All the stuff we talk about in first year contract law. Do the Donnie people have any real power to contract here? Or is this just, hey, here's what you're going to do, here's what we're going to give you, take it, or there's always the orbital bombardment option.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Well,
the Aldani burn it, which seems to mean that they don't particularly appreciate the arrangement, and it's not something they happily agreed to.
Right, there's some element of duress.
Yeah, what do we expect? Is this a meaningful negotiation in any sense of the word? And it's not as if the Empire doesn't know what would be fair market value for a piece of land that they need for those purposes. Whether an imperial credit has, the same sort of value to the Donnie people, I don't know, but there would certainly be restrictions in our world on your ability to lease or annex anything that's considered cultural property, so like religiously sacred land, that sort of, even something like a graveyard would be really significant nowadays to try to, in any way carve out property for a base that we're operating on, even a very small one. I mean, we'd just look for another place to put it, quite frankly. But the Empire doesn't seem interested in that. Their mindset seems to be, well, the Donnie people seem to like goat hides and they've accepted this deal, so we'll just give them a goat hide every year and they're not complaining, so who cares? The existence of the enterprise zone and the implication that the Empire is providing work there, and then they mention these what do they call them, recreational or entertainment facilities that they've put along the pathway to the sacred site to try to siphon off Donnie people with probably booze and other forms of entertainment. It suggests that the credit has some value, some recognition on the planet, like money means something, and not just whatever currency, goat hide or otherwise, that the Donnie people use. So they know, and they're purposefully trying to get this for effectively no cost. You mentioned Afghanistan, Bethany, and like we talk about the negotiation for military bases on foreign land happens all the time, and it looks very different depending on what country you're in. Very infrequently is the U.S. just given land to plop a base on in perpetuity. Oftentimes, especially in combat zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, we are leasing the land. We have some arrangement with who we believe to be the owner, and a lease is paid out. There's a transaction. There is money that changes hands, or whatever the agreement calls for. And so it's not unheard of, like this sort of arrangement that the empire has. We just pay fair market value, or whatever we determine that to be in the course of the negotiation. What's interesting, we make this connection with Aldani and the Dani people, and some of the similarities to say the Afghan people. And in particular, in Afghanistan, property law is a mess there. It's an absolute nightmare. The business of the drawdown and transferring land as we shut down bases, giving them back to the Afghan people, and more importantly, the people that properly owned that land, was an absolute nightmare. I kept myself very fortunate that I only tangentially got involved in that. But I think Aldani exists as probably a mirror to Afghanistan, because here in our world, you had this multitude of ownership documents. You had this multi-layered legal system. You had a state, you had a religious law, customary law, all of which could have pegged different owners. You had a changing of the guard in Afghanistan in terms of the Afghan national government, the Taliban, that both passed different laws recognizing or not recognizing certain property and certain records. In fact, in that country, the most comprehensive property law and like determination of what was and wasn't official property records that were recognized by the state was passed by the Taliban in 2000. And so I could easily see Aldani being a system where, because you have this diversity in the people and this sort of, I won't say evolution, because that suggests like a positive pathway, but this influence of the empire that's caused their civilization to shift, that you could easily have a situation there. Like who owns that land? The Dani people probably believe that it belongs to the people, right? Like, I don't know if there's a single owner of that sacred site. And so for the empire, that's not an easy situation to work through, but that's why Pepto comes in the big bottles. You got to do the right thing if you want to operate in a place like that.
Yeah, and it would be very dependent upon how their culture would view those lands as well, because whether or not they have extensive legal writings as a culture or not, they might have something that the empire doesn't really understand. Like that sacred site could legally, from the Aldani perspective, belong to no one, and it's there as essentially a type of national park of sorts where any Aldani can go. And maybe the different Aldani have tribes because they talked about different groups of them. But I think to a degree, the empire understands this, because from what I got from the episode was not that the Aldani are actually paying for the rest stops. The Imperial commanders seem to say that they offer the Aldani a ride, which is turned down. And so that in lieu of a ride, they set up these like support centers, but on purpose to like pull the Aldani away from finishing their difficult, traditional and sacred trek. They're trying to erode away their culture, their values, their sacred land, so that whoever is left the following year to try to fight won't be able to put up much of a fight. So it's a pretty sinister approach at eroding whatever culture, history, local legal approaches are from the empire, at least. Similarly with Afghanistan, like I can't imagine getting into that from a legal perspective, because there is the government in Kabul, and then there's all the Pashtun tribes up north. And so it's a very, like, how do you operate between laws that were made by the Taliban, laws that are made by the current government, and then tribal law that's may or may not be captured or agreed upon?
You and me both.
Okay, any other thoughts on issues with this lease? If not, we can move on to our final topic, at least on this list. the fate, what is the ultimate fate of Aldani? And what made me put this as our last topic is that in episode 1, we hear that the Canary language is lost, right? So the viewer has to use context to discern meaning during all of those flashbacks. And then in this episode 6, we hear this exchange between Luthen and some of the people who are in his shop, which starts with Luthen telling this customer, well, you can just make up whatever meaning you want for this inscription that is in a lost language, which is his sales pitch to her. And then that takes it to this other person who maybe kind of looks like Karn and maybe doesn't. We have to check, asking Luthen, well, do you have anything from Aldani, which foreshadows possibly Aldani's fate. But what does everybody think about the Empire's and the ISB's next steps for Aldani?
That reminded me of a bit earlier in the episode where Gorn is interpreting for the Colonel and the Donnie people, and he's just doing it wrong. You can see in the subtitles that's
everyone knows it's wrong.
Everyone knows it's wrong. He's just doing it because I think he's trying to preserve some relation between the Empire and the Donnie, and he's trying to soothe things over. But it reminded me the whole talk about, kind of languages, and this language means something and we don't know what this means. Always trust your interpreter.
There's talk in the by Partagaz, Major Partagaz of the ISB, of these planetary emergency retaliation plans. It's like a classic Empire phrase, if I've ever heard one. That somewhere there's a catalog of like how the boot heel gets to drop in the event of certain conditions. And we've seen from the publicly released trailers that the ISB is out in force, that Death Troopers are involved, and they sort of hit the ground. And at least for Aldani, I think the Donnie people are going to pay the price despite having no involvement. I imagine Bethany made a great point about like equipment left behind and whatnot. They hiked all the way up there in Donnie type clothing, at least the clothing that some of the pilgrims wore was similar. That was probably cast off. I don't know whether they burned it before they changed into the Imperial uniforms, but it's not going to take much for the Imperials to say, aha, you did this, or you participated or assisted in this, and you're going to pay the price for it. It at a minimum would probably accelerate plans to just wipe out that sacred site and deny access on into the future to watch the Eye from that valley.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead.
I think it's safe to say that whatever happens to them under the Empire, it's not going to be favorable to them. The Empire doesn't have a history of favorable outcomes to local cultures, especially in those situations. Look at
That's the understatement of the podcast.
I do my best. Look at Rebels with the stuff that happened on, was it Lothal?
Yeah, great example.
Where they just basically, the Empire declared martial law and said, well, one or two of you are rebels, so nobody gets to go outside, and we're going to have stormtroopers on the streets everywhere.
But you get to work in this cool TIE Defender plant, so opportunity.
Yeah. Job creation or something.
Yeah, Dedra is inbound. I think that her jurisdictional and rank issue has been solved by this convenient incident.
And that seems to be a common theme in the Empire, is that they are taking any excuse to weaponize fear and gain more power and gain more control, even within their own ranks. They're quickly shuttling off, or you see Darth Vader throughout the movies just force choke people to death for failing. And so this sort of fascist reign of fear, it's easy to see in watching some of these shows how the Empire gets to be what it is when we see the original trilogy, because they're just spreading and they're using everything that goes wrong as a chance to obtain more power, get rid of anyone who makes mistakes, and get rid of anyone who's in the way.
What's fascinating is they don't seem to recognize this, at least on Aldhani, as a rebel operation. The characterization is this is a robbery, and their mindset is, well, this is a bunch of pirates stealing the Empire's money, not this is a coordinated rebel attack. Like, it is unfathomable to the commandant and to the other folks there that there would be this sort of organized incursion and not just a band of thieves together. And I don't know that it's entirely clear. We'll see how it plays out with the ISB, but certainly they had their doubts institutionally about the galactic sort of interconnectedness or strength of any kind of unified rebel movement. And it's not until you see what presumably is a HoloNet report that's being read in Luthen's shop, public perception can shape governmental action on that front, and they would have a real keen interest, whether they believe there to be a burgeoning rebellion or not, in stamping out anything that would further fuel that rumor. But it speaks to the sort of gall and arrogance of the Empire that they just like can't wrap their mind around that this facility would be a target.
I'll jump in because I've been thinking about this as well. For the response from the Empire, the Commandant's a martyr and can be played as such. He had a heart attack, worked to death by the brutish rebels who came in and stole 80 million credits. You have the dead bodies. We presume dead for for Gorn and Telemann. I always mispronounce. Thank you.
Yeah.
Always mispronounce his name. Again, you can do background on that. You have the eyewitnesses. The widow and child of the Commandant either will be exploited for political gain for being the eyewitnesses to the terrible rebels that did this horrible act of terrorism, or they'll be bumped off as well. So that way the story is that everyone died. So there are a couple ways that they could be exploited in the story as well. It can be used to justify a Tonkin Gulf resolution or Patriot Act type response in a very heavy-handed way. The problem with that for the Empire is it does start extending them, and an Empire can be overextended, especially if you start putting in more harsh laws that subjugate people and repress freedoms. If you can no longer have your fancy dinner parties, people start taking notice that you can't go outside and buy cool stuff anymore. Pardon me. I'm confident that's not Karn in the shop. He's broke. That's not his mom. He wouldn't be with a woman with expensive tastes. So I'm pretty sure he's not there. And that was just some extra being able to ask for something Aldhani. However, if we do see a sketch come out from the suspected terrorists, that somebody's going to look like Andor, and that's how Karn gets back into the game. So that'd be my prediction on how he connects with Deidre.
Hopefully they draw him with that big Aldhani hat that he had with the big flaps.
I love the costumes in this.
Yeah.
They're new to Star Wars and absolutely Star Wars looking. So there's well done. I also just love seeing a real set. I'm all for doing the volume. It's a great way to actually get cool things made and not travel to another side of the planet. But There's something cool about Scotland and being outside and adding the FX when you need it. That's is pretty breathtaking.
Awesome. Well, are we ready to move on to final thoughts?
Yes.
Sure.
Seeing the thumbs up. Okay, going around again clockwise from my perspective. Jordan, final thoughts on this episode.
Again, I really liked it. I'm really excited to see where they go with the next arc of the show and see how they deal with the kind of fledgling rebellion and the founding of the Rebel Alliance, and like, well, I guess the applicable quote is from Princess Leia: "The more you tighten your grip, the more star systems will slip through your fingers." As the Empire's laws get harsher and harsher, as the retaliation for stuff like Aldhani we expect to continue, I think we'll see more and more about how people start to push back. I'll also say, I really think that's Karn at the end in Luthien's shop. I think they're going to tie him back in by having him have tracked down Luthien as a connection to Cassian. I could be wrong, but that's my prediction.
All right, we shall see. Thomas.
I'm ready to see the ISB in proper action. We've read about them enough. We've sort of seen tangential stuff about them. I'm ready to see that aspect, as brutal as it may be, of the Empire. And I'm very curious. I want to see more Mon Mothma. I'd take Mon Mothma every episode. But she mentioned having somebody she wanted to bring in the fold. And is it Leia? I don't know at this point. So very curious to see how that plays out.
All right, Bethany.
I'm loving this series. It feels like I'm watching episodic movies almost, like short movies, and I am fully into each episode. I'll second everything that everyone else said. I can't wait to see the rest of the series. One thing I'll touch on is the flow of the story is so good. There are complete story arcs within each episode, but the way that they build on each other is just so good. For lack of a better term, I'm gushing, so I'll stop, but I loved it.
Excellent. Josh, any final thoughts?
The series is excellent.
I see you have a person you'd like to have Mon Mothma be bringing in.
Oh, that's Jordan.
Oh, that was me.
That was you.
Yeah. No, I really want to see. I would much rather see Mon Mothma bring in. This goes a little deep cut Star Wars, but somebody like General Dodonna from the original movies, much more than I'd like them to bring in Leia. I think we can do Star Wars without the Skywalkers for a little bit, and it'd be nice to see them go in a different direction. And I think General Dodonna would be a really interesting character to get some more of the backstory on.
Yes, definitely. I too was excited to see Mon Mothma. I'm terrified for her every time I see her in a scene, because she seems to be in such peril at every turn. I suspect, although it's not something I want to see, we'll continue to see even more of the tragic effects of the Empire's colonization efforts. Keep her safe at all costs, please. Yes, I think that's how we all feel. So we're wrapping up. Everyone, we have a patron to thank. The handle of this person is Astro Kangaroo. So Astro Kangaroo, wherever you may be, we thank you. We very much appreciate you. And we're going to go ahead and sign off. And stay geeky, everyone.